You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 1st of October 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Iran launches missiles at Israel. Literal and political impact awaited. NATO's new Secretary-General begins at the deep end, and has one of Europe's weirdest crimes been solved? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nina Dos Santos and Theo Usherwood will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from honorary Madrileño Luke Stegeman about his new biography of Spain's underrated capital. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller. I will be joined today by Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and CNN's former Europe editor, and by Theo Usherwood, the political journalist and broadcaster. But first of all, we start in Israel, where right now Iranian missiles or fragments of Iranian missiles are landing on Israeli cities. The large-scale missile attack was launched from Iran within the last hour. We are joined first of all by Allison Kaplan Sommer, journalist for Haaretz. Alison, how are things right now?
Well, my perspective is from a stairwell in a building in Tel Aviv, so I haven't been outside to see what looks like really missiles raining all across Israel. There's been a siren in almost every single community. If you look at a map, it's covered by the red alerts. And so I'm looking at videos on the internet like everyone else from my shelter in the stairwell, but it looks like fireworks. It's explosions. Several missiles have clearly landed, but it's not clear yet to me where.
What kind of warning were you given about this? We saw the first reports here within the last hour from the IDF that they believed a launch was underway. What was the first you heard of it?
Yeah, about 3 hours ago came the reports from the White House that American officials were saying that there would definitely be an Iranian attack. Now, at first, the IDF spokesperson said that there were no signs that missiles were being launched. He changed his message, I guess, about half an hour later, and most Israelis were told very definitively to be somewhere very close to a shelter so they could take shelter, knowing that these missiles could attack imminently. We were told that they were going to come sometime during the past 12 hours, and in the previous attack in April, there were several hours of warning, much longer than this time. But apparently, this time they were able to launch some shorter range missiles, some shorter length missiles, which were able to travel faster. And so therefore, Israelis had less warning as to get to a sheltered spot.
There are also reports, as I'm sure you'll be aware, of shootings, at least 2 in Tel Aviv, another one in Jaffa. Has there been any official line from any Israeli authorities, who obviously are pretty busy right now, about whether or not they think that those shootings and these missiles are a coincidence?
Well, obviously, they're not a coincidence. And the reports of the shootings, the ones I saw, were all in Jaffa, which is technically part of Tel Aviv. Jaffa is part of the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. So those reports were that there was a shooting which is presumed to have been a terror attack, and it took place literally less than 15 minutes before the missiles came. So maybe when it comes to the precise timing of the shootings happening just before the missiles landed, it was a coincidence, but obviously it's not a coincidence that somebody was being alerted and told to create even more chaos and trouble in Israel than this missile attack is causing.
In the last few days in particular, did you detect anything different, I guess, in the way Israeli authorities were talking about a potential Iranian retaliation to how they spoke about it back in April, where, of course, Iran launched an enormous missile barrage at Israel, almost none of which actually reached a target, almost as if it had been kind of designed to fail theatrical exercise. Did this feel different, the anticipation of this one?
Well, it felt different in a way. It wasn't as bad because it wasn't unprecedented like last time. People were very frightened of the unknown last time. Last time, however, the lag time between the declaration that Iran was going to attack and the actual attack happened was many, many, many days. So people just sort of, they didn't relax, but they had time to get used to the idea. This time, it was a very quick turnaround between being alerted that an Iranian attack was happening and when it actually happened. So there was a much more of a feeling of, urgency, I would say.
I mean, I know this has only just happened and indeed is still happening, but have we had any kind of response to this, and obviously early response from Israel's government?
Not that I've seen any Israeli response. There was, while everyone was waiting for the attack, one of the right-wing members of the opposition, Avigdor Lieberman, tweeted that Israel shouldn't be sitting around waiting for an attack. They should be more proactive and they should be attacking Iran directly. But right now, we don't know anything about signs of retaliation directly on Iran or not. I would suspect if something was going to happen from Israel towards Iran, it wouldn't happen immediately.
We should also discuss the fact, while we have you, that Israel has begun some sort of invasion of Lebanon, at least in the south of the country. They are also continuing air raids further north. Has there been a line from Israeli officials on what the purpose of this undertaking is?
Yeah, well, it's not a secret that for the past year there have been missile attacks daily from last October 8th on northern Israel coming from Hezbollah, that for many years, basically Israel has had a knife to its throat in the north. Installations of Hezbollah that you could see within villages were, in the sight lines of northern Israel. So the goal of this exercise is to stop it, is to stop the constant attacks on northern Israel and allow the 60,000 Israelis who since October 8th have had to be refugees in their own country and far from their homes to allow them to return home. That's why Israelis are standing pretty staunch in the face of these attacks from Iran, because it has already endured a year of onslaught on its northern border, destroyed parts of whole cities, if not some whole communities, and know that this was something that had to be dealt with. So it's a long-term problem, and Israelis are willing to sacrifice short-term in order to keep the country safe in the long term.
On a related note then, has there been much discussion in recent weeks especially of comparisons with 1973 or 1967 when Israel did fight, existential wars on several fronts at once?
Yeah, but I think it's different because back then Israel was fighting countries. These were real official, organized wars country to country with, some sort of order and ground rules. Right now, Israel is under attack from various guerrilla terrorist forces, which are proxies of Iran, but they're not real armies. And so it's much more challenging, I think, and much more difficult and complicated. And I think the threat to the home front is much greater than it was back then. So I don't think there's very many comparisons there.
Allison Kaplan Sommer in Tel Aviv, thank you very much for joining us. We will bring tonight's daily panel in now, Nina Dos Santos and Theo Usherwood. Nina, first of all, the cycle of escalation does now appear to be underway. It doesn't seem likely that Israel is not going to respond to this in some fairly brisk manner, but what options would they realistically have?
Well, cybersecurity is one way. The real fear, though, is that Israel might decide to attack some of Iran's nuclear facilities, that eventually would be the goal here, to try and, for once and for all, take out some of Iran's nuclear ambitions. And what's interesting is that, Iran has a new president who's very much untested here. And I remember just a week or so ago at the United Nations General Assembly, he actually talked about potentially reviving the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear talks. So I wonder whether or not that is where Israel may go next. If that happens, obviously the big question is, would this drag Iran and Israel into a broader conflagration, maybe even a war in the Middle East? And that, of course, would drag the United States in. Has to be said that the US has about 40,000 troops in the region at the moment. Just 2 days ago, Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, put the US Army on alert to potentially send more to the region. And it's got, warships that can help Israel to defend itself, to shoot down any of these ballistic missiles that might end up hitting Israel.
Because, Theo, it's not difficult to see in present circumstances that Israel might actually see an opportunity here to settle this once and for all, because everything else shorn away for years, I think Israel has thought that Iran is the ballgame. That is the source of all its present woes. And in recent years, Israel has it's picked off a lot of countries that would have been relative allies of Iran when it came to Israel. They've become diplomatic partners, friends, allies almost of Israel. Iran isolated, Hezbollah possibly neutralised. Might Israel think this is the moment?
I think, and I was just having a conversation with a friend in the Israeli government on my way over to this show, just to get a broader picture of what they were trying to achieve with this. And they look at Hezbollah, and this is what they're saying to me. They look at Hezbollah differently to Hamas, and likewise they look at the Houthis in the same way as they look at Hezbollah, is that they don't want to eliminate Hezbollah and the Houthis in the same way that they set about eliminating Hamas. This is from Netanyahu's point of view about securing Israel. Now, of course, October the 7th, it was a terrorist attack, and that put the onus on Netanyahu, and this is the view of the Israeli government, to take out Hamas once and for all. But what Israel is trying to do at the moment is secure these are the claims, it's trying to secure its borders so that it can exist peacefully. Now, the onus then goes to Iran as to whether Iran is going to press ahead with its stated intentions to, in effect, see the elimination of Israel. Israel is a nuclear power, and just to Nina's point about whether Israel goes after Iran's nuclear facilities, I think that's a very realistic question now, because of course if Iran is to obtain a nuclear weapon or nuclear capabilities, and we know that they've been in talks with the Russians, and there's been intelligence about sharing of resources for the Russians in return for nuclear, conversations about enhancing its nuclear program, that actually then you would see a much greater escalation. But at the moment, and I think you also made the point in your questioning with the correspondent in Tel Aviv, is this just what we saw in April, where it's this show of force, this theatrical show of force that actually the Iranian regime needs to put across that actually it is doing something in response to the incursions or invasion, you can choose your word as you like, into southern Lebanon, into the assassination of Nasrallah? Or is it actually a much more sustained attack, which is part of a broader plan to escalate this up to all-out war in the Middle East? And I'm not sure that question, going by the information we have at the moment, has been answered, but I think it'll be answered fairly shortly.
Nina, we don't know yet, obviously, what damage may have been done by these Iranian missiles, and we may not know until the sun comes up tomorrow properly, but is that likely, do you think, to govern Israel's response? Like, if it turns out that, akin to April, in which I think only one person was injured, that the human casualties certainly are not actually that serious, that's one thing. But if it turns out that some of those missiles have properly landed, does that become a whole other thing?
Well, in mid-April, 300 missiles were fired, and they were almost easily repelled by, obviously, Israel's specific ability to intercept these missiles. Also, it can rely on allies in the region, as I was saying before, like the United States, the UK, to help as well, and Jordan. But having said that, I think what's really different here is we're seeing reports of potential terrorist attacks taking place in Tel Aviv, and also in Tel Aviv, Jaffa or Yaffo, depending on where you're from and how you call that part of southern Tel Aviv. And if indeed we're seeing sort of guerrilla warfare type tactics taking place on Israeli soil in tandem with the Houthis over the last 24 hours, having also fired their own missiles and rockets in the direction of Israel, you've got a multi-prong attack here, and I think that's what could be quite concerning. And, raise the spectre that we're talking about something that might be different from April the 13th.
Just finally on this, Theo, because we are still at that stage of a story where what we don't know vastly outweighs what we do. But I mentioned to Allison the comparison with 1967, with 1973, but there have been other moments as well where Israel has taken direct action to neutralise what they perceived as possibly an existential threat. They blew up Iraq's nuclear reactor when Iraq tried to build one. They blew up Syria's when Syria tried to build one. If Israel does perceive this as a moment akin to that and is determined to act in a decisive way against Iran, is there anything the United States can actually do at this point to stop them, or does the US basically have to resign themselves to helping?
I think the United States has been very clear, and the UK has been very clear. Iran cannot obtain a nuclear weapon, and if Iran is to suddenly become a nuclear power, that is going to be hugely destabilising to the whole region. And I don't think, the United States, even under Biden, and then it will be, I'm sure, if Harris wins the election, and it will be under her administration. I don't see a variation in that policy that you can somehow have a nuclear-armed Iran, whether it's with a full nuclear capability or with some sort of the ability to launch a dirty nuclear bomb, whether it be against Israel or any other state for that matter. Of course, I think in all likelihood it would be against Israel. But I think that the United States is not going to simply stand aside to one side and allow that to happen, regardless of who is running the White House and regardless of who wins on November the 5th.
Well, let's move along somewhat, because meanwhile Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, may shortly be reflecting that he has chosen quite a week to begin his tenure as Secretary-General of Nato. Today he officially succeeded former Norwegian Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, who steps down after 10 years precisely, the alliance's second longest serving leader. Rutte is the fourth Dutchman to hold the office. He already faces one self-evident challenge on NATO's eastern flank, i.e. Russia's continuing rampage in Ukraine. He may be weeks away from facing another challenge from the west, i.e. the return to the White House of a US president, of whom it is not altogether clear which side he is on. Nina, you have the advantage of having met Mark Rutte. What kind of Secretary-General do we imagine him being? They have tended, certainly, well, if we're thinking of Stoltenberg as the current model template, to appoint somebody who's fairly calm, collected, non-confrontational.
Indeed, I've met Mark Rutte on many occasions under difficult circumstances and more positive ones. I remember one of the times I met him was on the fringes of Davos when, as I was saying before, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear accord, had just come into force, and we saw the then president of Iran being welcomed and feted by the great and the good of the world elite, sitting in the front row in Davos. Boy, have things changed. So this is somebody who has a lot of relationships from his time as one of the longest serving leaders across Europe. And for the Netherlands, he was in office for 13 years. That means that he was able to very successfully mount a one-man charm offensive and see off the person who really some people thought should have got the job, which is, and I can see you smiling here, Kaja Kallas, the Estonian Prime Minister. She was viewed as too bellicose, perhaps, as a choice, too thorny as a choice, because obviously the Baltic states are quite concerned about the possibility of a Russian invasion into NATO territory. So I think he's going to be certainly a warmer character than Jens Stoltenberg, who famously is a man of few words. He's going to be a bit more conciliatory, but of course he does have his detractors, most notably Viktor Orban of Hungary, who tried very hard to prevent him from getting this job.
Theo, there was some grumbling about Mark Rutte being appointed, especially from the Baltics and the Eastern European countries, and I was on the receiving end personally of quite a lot of that grumbling. But one of the points that those dissenters made was that one thing that the new Secretary-General will have to do is buck everybody's ideas up on defence spending, that they must reach that 2.5% threshold of GDP spent on defence. The Netherlands has only just cleared that, and not once in all the years that Rutte was Prime Minister did they get anywhere near it.
And the reason this is important is because if you're looking to the other side of the Atlantic and to America and Donald Trump potentially winning the White House, he's been clear that he does not want America to continue to be the main breadwinner for NATO, the main contributor to NATO, and that if you do not have, NATO cannot exist with the Russian, you might say, without the threat of Russia, without the war in Ukraine. NATO, there is some reason NATO can be an effective force, but given what we've seen in Ukraine, it's very difficult to envisage NATO without America, without American support, and by that we're referring, of course, to whether that now is brought into question by the US presidential elections in November, how it can be successful in repelling Vladimir Putin's advances into Ukraine, because of course Rutte is taking part. Taking the lead in NATO, taking this job at a time where it is more likely than ever, should Putin be successful in Ukraine, he will then start to pick off those other Baltic states. And in order to make sure that doesn't happen, Rutte needs to bring Trump with him. And Trump has been very clear that he is not happy with the level of defence spending in Europe, and he wants to see European nations contribute more. And if you turn around, and these are this conversation I had with somebody close to Trump, who was saying, actually, if you just turn around and ignore him, then he's not going to receive that well. But if you, as it was put to me, if you kiss the ring and you say, okay, I acknowledge your point, then he is potentially for turning, and you can maintain that US support. And we saw the advances that Putin made when there was that delay in Congress with that $60 billion odd of funding for Zelensky's forces, and they couldn't get the money in time, they couldn't get the support in time, and the strength and how that empowered Putin. So it's absolutely crucial and the noises off from Rutte already are that actually he wants to see that, and you rightly point to the criticism, but it's absolutely crucial that defence spending goes up, not simply because, regardless of America, Europe will be able to defend itself against Putin, but in order to bring, it to hedge against a Trump win in November, and to ensure that every possible opportunity is given to bringing Trump into NATO, to get it contributing towards NATO, to see off Putin.
But if I may interject, though, one thing has changed radically over the last couple of years since 2022, and that is the fact that the axis since the Cold War has shifted at a time when the Netherlands used to spend less than 2% of GDP on its defence. It was right next door to Germany. The US has all these air bases there. It's a legacy of the Cold War. But since then, we've had to cope with the peace dividend, and things have changed radically. And now I would say that, the axis of European security is obviously shifted far to the east and actually outside of NATO's borders. One of the conversations that he's going to have to navigate, as you were saying before, Theo, is obviously Donald Trump. Apparently they're friendly. Donald Trump has described him as a friend. I would say a friend for now. But the other thing he's going to have to deal with is, lots of people inside his own borders, indeed his own country, we're seeing soaring numbers of support for the far right, and most of those far right parties are united in not wanting to spend to help Ukraine. So it's not just coming from the United States. It's this sort of torpedoing of the whole NATO purpose from inside on both sides of the Atlantic.
But just to follow that up, Nina, how much of a part of his job is going to be trying to keep European partners focused on the idea of what President Macron of France called strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe can't proceed on the assumption that the United States will always be unconditionally willing to send the cavalry over the hill?
Well, we're seeing a dynamic at the moment where we're asking ourselves whether the United States will do that for places like the Middle East as well. So we're seeing these conversations play out in real time. Obviously, he's going to have a harder time with Emmanuel Macron because Emmanuel Macron famously called NATO brain dead. We've got Ursula von der Leyen, the former Defence Secretary of Germany, now installed for a second term at the helm of the European Commission, and she has pivoted their whole agenda towards this issue of defence, talking about defence procurement procurement. They're going to have to buy weaponry, and she wants it to be European weaponry. But then obviously that raises the question of whether or not France, as the biggest EU defence manufacturer, is going to provide it, and how comfortable Germany will be about that. We know that Rutte is a lot closer to Germany than he is, for instance, to France. So it may well be that he has to navigate that type of friction between those two key member states.
And Theo, just finally on this one, how much of an act of diplomacy is it going to be to keep everybody pointed in the same direction on Ukraine, especially if it turns out that the war is not going to end anytime soon, and it may not end as Ukraine would prefer it to?
Yes, and you think back to last week when Zelensky attended the United Nations, and he didn't receive... I mean, it was the most I've seen him struggling in that sort of forum than ever before. I mean, he did not cut the same figure that he did at the beginning of the conflict when he was appearing on Zoom calls or he was on television interviews, and he was seen as this sort of at the front line of the defence of the West. So I think it's going to become harder for Zelensky, and the pressure is going to be on to cut some sort of deal with Putin. And if that involves, and the danger is with this, and if that involves carving off a part of eastern Ukraine and handing that over to Russia, Putin can then go back and say, well, that was a win. That strategy worked. And then does he come back for one of the smaller Baltic states potentially and start to have a go at a NATO member? And then what does NATO do? Because whether something that's played well for NATO until now, they've been very fortuitous about, I would say, is that Ukraine isn't a NATO member. NATO is going to be tested if Putin goes for one of the smaller members, and then it's that argument of the whole existence of NATO is to stand up for that member. And I just say, just finally on Nina's point, I'd completely agree with what Nina's saying, just about that idea of the pressure from within Europe, particularly from, we've seen the far right in terms of Austria. We have Giorgia Meloni in Italy as well. This is the pressure cooker within Europe that Putin has, to greater or lesser extent, depending on your view, has tried to create in terms of migratory flows as well into Europe, putting pressure, and then seeing the election of far-right parties to the very highest echelons of government. And we've seen them get to the very top in Austria, to the very top in Italy, and in Germany we saw those regional wins as well for the AfD. And it's that pincer movement with Trump on the other side of the Atlantic possibly, and then what we're seeing in Europe too.
Well, to Sweden now, and a possible step towards a solution to one of the most baffling unsolved crimes not only in Swedish history but anybody's history. The 1986 assassination of then Prime Minister Olof Palme, shot dead in central Stockholm as he walked home from the cinema. One conviction for the murder was overturned. Another favoured suspect died in 2000 without being tried. The author of a new book on the murder has used AI to match an unpublished police composite to a different suspect who may have had both the motive and weapon, and who killed himself in 2008 when police visited his home. Theo, first of all, we'll talk about, well, whether we're beguiled by AI being used to solve crimes, but are we beguiled by this particular thesis?
I think it's a fantastic story, and I've started watching a documentary on Netflix with Bill Gates about the use of AI, and the focus at the very beginning of the series is on education and health. And I didn't think actually that where it gets more exciting is when it comes to crime. This is a story about John Jordis. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, who started looking into it. He was only 4 years old when, at the time of Olof Palme's murder, but he started looking into it, and he got the facial composite, which I understand there's drawings that the artist's impressions, and he compared it against the suspects at the time. It was only when it came to Krista Pettersson, who was an alcoholic petty criminal charged with the murder in 1989 but soon eliminated, she only got an 18% match. And then you go down, and then there was a much closer fit, according to AI, with somebody called Krista Anderson, a metro train driver. But tragically, we'll never know for sure, because when police officers They received a call for help back in 2008 from a family member, went round to knock on his door about something completely unrelated. And the story goes that they would have had no idea about this connection to the murder. There was a bang on they knocked on the door, waited for 10 minutes, and there was a loud gunshot, and he'd killed himself.
Should we be braced is my concern. I pass no judgment, Nina, on the whether or not this particular thesis holds water, but you can see where this is leading. Like, airport bookshops are going to be stacked from floor to ceiling with books suggesting that they have used AI to solve some or other historical mystery. That is where this is heading, isn't it?
Will they be written by ChatGPT? That's what I want to know.
Almost certainly.
Oh God! Right, then we can figure out which filler words are going to be there. I don't know. I mean, look, we already know that the use of genetic footprint and gene testing for, ancestry reasons and stuff like that, uploading your data onto these websites like history and ancestry.com has actually had some... It led police to some criminals. That's quite controversial, actually, because unwitting family members might upload their genetic, family tree, and then it turns out somebody on the other side of the planet gets caught many years later. Up for debate about whether or not that, has attendant privacy issues. I think this is almost similar, isn't it? I suppose the question is, as we talk about AI being biased in many cases, what's actually interesting about this case, and I do remember having gone to Sweden and interviewed members of the Kurdish community, and for many years it was assumed that members of the PKK Kurdish community, Kurdish resistance members who were resident in Sweden, had been given asylum there, might have been behind the murder of Olof Palme. But it turns out, according to this, this theory potentially could be eventually put to bed. So, as I was saying before, bias on one side and potentially bias on another.
Well, just as a final thought then, I will ask each of you in turn. I'll start with you, Theo. If there was a means of assembling some apparatus of artificial intelligence to solve some particular mystery which has beset you personally, what would you set it to solve?
Oh, blimey! Solve. I'd love to outsource my whole life organisation to a computer. If I could go on and I know somebody might say, well, it's already there with an iPhone, but if I could, if a computer could literally just, if I could have some sort of visual screen of my day at 7 o'clock in the morning when I wake up on some sort of, one of those glasses, then I'd take that.
Nina, would you like to outsource either any aspect of your own life or the solving of a particular historical mystery to AI? I would settle for a program right now that can tell me where my scissors are. It's driving me nuts.
No, it's the blind panic that just keeps me going. That's what it is, I would say, like a human dynamo. The one thing I would like to see AI solve, and I suspect this story means that people are already onto it, is the case of Jack the Ripper.
Oh,
I mean,
God, that's
wouldn't we could finally put an end to all those endless documentaries on the subject.
In an airport bookstore near you imminently, it will be Jack the Ripper, JFK, have we really been colonised by aliens? This is the publishing future that awaits us. And on that happy note, Nina Dos Santos and Theo Usherwood, thanks for joining us. Finally, on today's show, Spain, to understate matters wildly, does not lack options for the visitor, especially a visitor who enjoys the beach. Possibly for this reason, Spain's inland capital, Madrid, often languishes unconsidered by tourists, beyond perhaps a quick whip through its justly famous galleries. It is the contention of our next guest that this state of affairs is a disservice to both Madrid and those who would enjoy it if they took the time to know it. Luke Stegeman's new book, Madrid, A New Biography, makes a case that the city has not merely an enthralling past and an alluring present, but every expectation of a scintillating future. I spoke to Luke earlier and began by asking where his lifelong love for Madrid began.
The beginning of Madrid was back in the mid-'80s when, as a young Australian just out of university, I travelled, as so many did back then, around Europe with a backpack. And I spent a fair bit of time in Spain and I loved so many places there, but I really enjoyed Madrid as well. And then a couple of years later, still, my early 20s, I thought I'd come back and do a year or two of English language teaching, and ended up in Madrid and really fell in love with the city, with the people. As I started to learn about the history, the style, the culture, I really, really fell in love with it. And much as I have a great love for all things Spanish, but Madrid has kind of been the central focus of my nearly 4 decades long fascination with the Hispanic universe.
Your book makes the case that it is a overlooked, under-regarded European capital, certainly. If you think of it in opposition to the ones people think of and maybe obsess about more, like Paris or Amsterdam or Berlin, how would you sum up its municipal character? How is Madrid different from those places?
Well, look, I don't know those places as well as I know Madrid, obviously. But the reason why I talk about Madrid being neglected and overlooked is because, well, one of the things that I found when I went to write the book, I wanted to write the book anyway, but I found that there was there'd only been one fairly slim biography of Madrid written in English. So essentially I found this is a book which is, in terms of the sort of Anglo-Saxon historiography or the world of letters, have completely ignored Madrid. I think it's a place where it's quite difficult. Madrid is not an obviously, if you go to Paris or London or Berlin, the places have these obvious attractions. Madrid, you need to spend a little bit more time there. I think it's a more difficult place to get to know, but it's a place which, once you do know it, really, really opens up a tremendous array of charms and fascinations. And the people, of course, are just marvellous in Madrid. So I think different visitors would find different points of comparison between those major European capitals. But I guess one of the points I wanted to make was that, look, this is now it's a major world city because it has changed so much, particularly in the last 20 years, and it is increasingly so in that respect. So I wanted to bring people's attention to it because it is my favourite city in the world.
Is it actually affectionately regarded by other Spaniards outside Madrid, or is it sort of like their Canberra or their Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I'd say it's rather like their Canberra or Washington, D.C., yes. It has that kind of reputation, and it's interesting that negative impressions of Madrid go back 400 years. So basically that negative attitude of a lot of people in the rest of Spain towards Madrid is not something new. Certainly over the last 20 or 30 years, when Madrid has among other things, has replaced Catalonia as the sort of the financial driving force of Spain, or Barcelona and Catalonia, there's always a kind of resentment to Madrid. It comes down to its financial power. Madrid has kind of led Spain in terms of financial deregulation over the last 20 years or so, creating this extraordinarily business-friendly environment. But it's also politically, being the heart of the nation's politics. As you would know, there's a lot of sort of peripheral nationalisms on the Iberian Peninsula, and a lot of those are very resentful of Madrid as well. And of course, it also goes back to there are still the kind of lingering resentment of the 40 years of the dictatorship based out of Madrid as well.
I was curious as well as to how you go about putting together a book which is essentially a biography of a city, and it's not a small book. You have still tipped the scales, I think, at nearly 500 pages, and it is an extraordinary story from, beginning with this 16th century whim of Philip II up until the present day, taking in such events as the Cape and Hat riot of 1766, which I mentioned because I think that was my favourite bit. But how do you decide what to leave out when you're putting this story together?
That's a really interesting question because, funnily enough, when we took the first draft and started slashing bits and pieces, I'd actually included a lot of my own personal story in the book, and a lot of that got cut back, a lot of that. You mentioned about starting with Philip II and his whim, but really that comes in at about page 100 in the book because there's about 600 or 700 years before that, which are really, really neglected, but they are important. Madrid wasn't a capital city, but it was a medieval town before then. And I found that really, really fascinating. I think I sort of highlighted the key historical moments I thought you can't really miss. So you have to cover all the key dynastic elements, the key riots, the key revolutions, the wars. When you do a history like this, you realise, my God, Madrid has really suffered a lot over the years. For all the way a lot of people are negative about Madrid is it's this kind of proud, preening kind of place, but in fact it's a city that has suffered an enormous amount over the years as well, of deprivation, wars, revolutions, famines, and so on. So I guess what I actually found, Andrew, the most interesting part was the last sort of 50 years or so is compressed into kind of only about 30 pages, because what I did find is when you're writing about a long period of history, you've got to be really careful writing about what's essentially the present moment, because any judgment, you don't have perspective on it, and particularly any value judgments you make, I think, as we all know, that stuff grows old so quickly. So I guess my last real analysis was stuff during the 1980s. Then I do bring it up to the present day, but with just a couple of key moments over the last couple of years, which were, I think, of great importance. And one was just looking at, I chose two moments of immense stillness, because a city like Madrid, which is this kind of constantly sort of boiling away, constantly frenetic activity, there were two moments of real stillness. And one was, of course, the shutdown during COVID, and looking at the impact that had on the city, bringing a kind of stillness to it. And then also in 2021, there was this enormous snowstorm, which left the city completely covered in snow for 4 or 5 days. And that also brought, and I compare it as a kind of different type of stillness. One was almost like a friendly stillness, and the other was a kind of hostile stillness. And I thought I'd chose those two to sort of bring the narrative to a close. I tried to avoid any kind of, or any overt political judgments of more recent times, because that's very tricky territory.
Well, just finally then, we'll let you bring some of your own personal story back in. I'm sure we have listeners who are planning to visit Madrid at some point in the imminent future. What's something non-obvious that you would recommend they do or see?
Madrid has a number, of course, very, very famous museums, but it has a number of lesser-known museums, which are museums of fine arts, decoration and so on. And I can think of at least three which are absolutely spectacular. The Lázaro Galdiano, for example, is one. It's only about 15 minutes north of where the Prado Museum is, and that's a wonderful place to visit. I'd also recommend visiting the city's parks. It has some fantastic parks. One of the things that I wanted to knock on the head in the book was this idea that Madrid is a sort of concreted, ugly, sterile place. It's actually full of greenery. It has some beautiful parks. I'd go for the parks and the lesser-known decorative arts museums, which are fabulous.
That was Luke Stegeman. His new book, Madrid, A New Biography, is available now. Very much recommended. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nina Dos Santos and Theo Usherwood. Also to Allison Kaplan Sommer in Tel Aviv at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.